computer. There we go. All right. This session is called The One and the Many. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes.
And it's part one of the Dharmic religions of the Indian subcontinent. I need to explain why I titled it The One and the Many as soon as I can figure out why. Technical difficulties, sorry about that. Screen share this again. I'm gonna have to edit this just because it's an awkward beginning. All right, the one and the many. The reason why I entitled this is because it seems to be that this is a particular preoccupation with the various schools of Hinduism. The search for the one thing that lies behind all things in the universe is what we in the West call the problem of the one and the many. It's a philosophical problem across the board, Eastern and Western, but in the East, they have a particular flair for discussing this issue. It becomes the issue of issues when it comes to how one understands the universe. It begins, though, with an assumption, and that is that the universe is one thing. Even in the sciences, in scientific materialism, especially in the area of physics, there's the search for the theory of everything, that theory which holds it all together. And it's been an elusive search for the theory of everything, but you see that it even affects questions on a scientific level. But because the universe is one thing, there must be one unifying cause or aspect that explains what we see, the multiplicity of all phenomena in the world. That's the reason why I entitled this session, The One and the Many. The Dharmic religions refer not only to Hinduism, but to Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism. They all have a commonality in that they derive from this Indian culture. They're culturally Indian. They all derive from the Indian subcontinent, and they all have a relationship in some degree with each other, especially Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. Sikhism is actually quite a recent religion, and there are some who theorize that Sikhism may have been influenced by Islam. It's got a monotheistic, almost like an Abrahamic religion in some ways. I don't want to call it an Abrahamic religion, but a monotheism that looks a lot like what we would see in the West as monotheism. By the Indian subcontinent, we mean that area of the world that was once this during the about 55 million years ago, smashed into the European plate. You know, you have this tectonic plates, the shifting of continents, the movement, and the Indian subcontinent was separated from a larger supercontinent and migrated north. Now, it didn't do it overnight. It took many, many millions of years, but about 55 million years, it smashed into the European plate and created the Himalayas. The countries that make up the Indian subcontinent today would be, of course, India, the largest, Pakistan and Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, and the islands called the Maldives. This is, if you will, culturally Indian, but also geologically Indian. Pakistan and Bangladesh were once considered part of India during the time when the British ruled India. And when India gained its independence, Pakistan broke away as an Islamic or majority Islamic country, and Bangladesh was part of that breakaway, and then they eventually became an independent country. Nepal and Bhutan have always been independent kingdoms, and they retain that independence today. The concept of Dharma, what all these religions have in common is a number of theological terms or concepts, and Dharma being the major one. That's why they're called the Dharmic religions. It is a key concept on the Indian subcontinent. Unfortunately, there's no single word in any Western language that conveys the meaning of Dharma. However, it also carries slightly different meanings in each of the different religious traditions that use the term Dharma. But that said, there's more commonality than not. In Hinduism, Dharma is one of the four components of Purusartha, which are the aims or the objectives of life. These would be behaviors, human behaviors, that are considered in accord with Rata. Rata is the order of the universe. And so there's a connection, if you will, between our morality, societally, individually, and the cosmic order. It's not, in the West, we think of morality as just sort of a consensus between society, within society, of actions that we should do or not do, be kind to each other, be honest. In Hinduism or in these Dharmic religions, there's a much greater connection or consciousness that what is done in the human realm, moral actions in the human realm, affect the entire cosmic order. There's a connection. They're integrally intertwined. So if you want to give Dharma a simple meaning in Hinduism, it simply means a right way of living. And these would include the duties that you have in society, your rights that you may have, law, conduct. All of that is subsumed under this term Dharma. And as I said, there's a connection between these things and the cosmic order itself. As used in the other religions of the Indian subcontinent, in Buddhism, Dharma means something along the lines of cosmic law and order. In Jainism, it refers to the teachings of their gurus, especially their last one, Tirthankara. And these were the teachings pertaining to purification and the moral transformation of human beings. Sikhism sees it in terms of religious practice, the path of righteousness, as far as the worship of the one God. Part one, that we just basically did the introduction here. Part one, I want to ask the question, what is Hinduism? And that's really a loaded question, because Hinduism is hard to nail down. First of all, it's hard to nail down because the term Hindu is not a term which derives from some sort of prophet. We talk of the Abrahamic religions, and by that we mean those religions like Judaism, Christianity, Islam, that see Abraham as their founder. We talk about Christianity, and of course, Christ is the main figure in Christianity. The old term for Islam was Mohammedism. It was a Western term. It was a term that the Muslims used, but nonetheless, it acknowledged that Muhammad was the prophet. Well, Hindu doesn't carry that kind of connotation at all. Hindu does not mean someone who worships Hindu or some or religion founded by some guy named Hindu. It's not a concept, a religious concept. It's an exonym. And an exonym is a name that's given by outsiders to a people of a particular country or location. It's derived from an Indo-Aryan Sanskrit name Sindhu, which means a large body of water. And the large body of water in this instance happens to be the Indus River in the northwest part of the subcontinent and all of its tributaries. The earliest references to Hindu or something like that would be the Greeks and the Persians, who called the people of the Indus Valley Hindus. So originally it referred to the people and the culture of the Indus River and its tributaries. And there are a lot of related terms to it. Of course, the original word Sindhu, our word Hindu, Hindustan, which means the country of the Hindus, the word Indus for the river, and of course, India. They all derive from that. So to call someone a Hindu, in a sense, is to call someone, to say that that person is from India. That would be a perfectly, perfectly correct usage of that term, depending on what time of history it's being used. This is a close-up of the map. You see that there are two major river valleys. The one in the northwest is the Indus, and the one in the northeast is the Ganges. They are the two, if you will, this is the cradle of the Indus civilization, and where the Hinduism as we know it today, much of what we know about Hinduism derives from these regions. It's often called the oldest continuous and still existing religion in the world. It goes back to about 1500 before the Common Era. Now, I have to hesitate at this point and tell you that the dates that I use in some of these slides are by Western, they're Western dates. They're disputed, in other words. There are Indian scholars who will tell you that Hinduism goes back 35,000 years. I'm not going to try to dispute that, but I will stick to the Western dates. I think in many ways, based upon archaeology and linguistics, those dates make the most sense. Nonetheless, you need to know that the part of the problem of studying Hinduism on an academic level is that as Westerners, we're outsiders, and this causes no small amount of debate with Indian scholars, especially adherents of Hinduism. Caveat, though, that I would emphasize is though that it is such an old religion, as we know it today, it really took shape in the Common Era, so after the time of Christ. Yes, its foundations are very, very old, but as it's expressed today, it's very much birthed in the Common Era. The question, though, is it a religion? Can we actually call it a single religion, or is it a family of religions? What is Hinduism? There's two common caricatures of Hinduism in the West. The first is to simply assume that it's polytheistic, that it's that Hinduism is a polytheism, worship of many gods. And there's some truth in that. Oftentimes you'll hear that, someone will ask the question, well, how many gods are there in Hinduism? And someone will throw out the number 33 million. Well, that's a conveniently rounded off figure. It tells me one of two things. Either it's a bit of an exaggeration, or it's an underestimate. Either way, I don't think anyone's actually sat down and tried to figure out how many gods there are in Hinduism. There are a lot. There are a lot of, they're the main gods that everyone knows, and there are millions of others that may be worshipped in particular villages or even by particular family groups. So there are a lot of gods in Hinduism, and when you look at Hinduism in that way, it does look very polytheistic, particularly to Western eyes, but it's also pantheistic. And oftentimes you'll hear in the West that Hinduism is more of a philosophy than it is a religion. Pantheism is the belief that everything is God, not just some figure that is worshipped through some image or idol, or some abstract idea of a transcendent God, but everything that exists is God. God is all is God. And this is because Hindu philosophy tends to go in this direction philosophically towards what in the West we call monism, that everything is one thing, and identifies all multiplicity with this underlying one thing, which in Hinduism is called the Brahman. The Rig Veda, which is the oldest of the Vedas, has something to say about this in various places. Probably the most famous saying in the Rig Veda is, "Truth is one, sages call it by various names." And this is in the context where truth is a reference to God. God is one, sages call God by various names. It's a way to, again, the problem, the one and the many. Why are there many gods? Why do you worship this God? And over here we worship that God. Well, everyone is worshiping the same thing, the concept God. We simply call it by various names. Because Hinduism is such a vast and broad term, some have questioned whether Hinduism can be called a single religion. It's probably better to refer to it as an umbrella term for a vast number of religious traditions which originated in India, each drastically different from the others. And then someone will point out, well, you can say that about pretty much every religion. Every religion can be described in terms of an umbrella, which encompasses many different ways of believing. Take Christianity. We have Catholics and we have Protestants. Within Protestantism, we have how many different denominations and sects and non-denominational churches? And that doesn't take into account the Eastern Orthodox churches and the Oriental Orthodox churches, and then of course you have some groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons, which could be considered under that umbrella of Christianity. Yeah, that's true. Every religion can be described in terms of an umbrella encompassing many different ways of believing in that faith. Yet the various religious traditions that fall under the name of Hinduism seem to be artificially united to an unusual degree. When you look at the diversity within Hinduism, you got the first thing that presents itself to any Western observers, the multiplicity of cults, different temples, different images and idols. And each of these cults have different theologies and philosophies and ritual practices. Then you consider there are people who are truly polytheist, and some who are pantheist, and some who are panentheist, and some who are henotheist, and some who are monotheist, and some who are monists, and some who are agnostics. And even atheists and humanists have all found a space to coexist under this term Hinduism. So we're talking about this huge umbrella, which a lot of people from different points of view can stand under. And then there's no unified system of belief or creed. Supreme Court of India put it this way: said, unlike other religions in the world, the Hindu religion does not claim any one prophet. It does not worship any one god. It does not believe in any one philosophic concept. It does not follow any one act of religious rites or performances. In fact, it does not satisfy the traditional features of a religion or creed. It is a way of life and nothing more. So this is not just something that is acknowledged in the West as we're looking at Hinduism. The Supreme Court itself in India basically is saying the same thing. That said, here's my but, here's the caveat. There are certain core features that unify all Hindu religious traditions and fundamentally separate Hinduism as a concept or as a religion from other religions in the world. The first would be the commonality of their sacred texts. Now, there is no Bible per se in Hinduism. We think the Bible's huge, 66 books, right? 39 of the Old Testament, 27 of the New. Then you have the apocryphal books, and you think, wow, that's a huge book, a lot there to study. Well, Christianity and Judaism has nothing, or Islam even for that matter, has nothing on Hinduism when it comes to sacred texts. There are hundreds of sacred texts, but there are important ones that every Hindu seems to acknowledge as being, if you will, the defining character of Hinduism. And above all are the Vedas. These are ancient ritual hymns that really form the foundation of what we call Hinduism today. The most important part of the Vedas would be the Upanishads, which is the last section of the Vedas to have been written. The Puranas, which are traditional histories and lore, and there are a number of these. There are two epic poems, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. The Mahabharata is the longest epic poem in human history. There isn't one longer. It puts Homer to shame. And part of the Mahabharata is the Bhagavad Gita, which is a conversation between an incarnation of Vishnu by the name of Krishna, who is a charioteer talking to his general or his leader right before an important battle that would take place. And then there are agamas. The agamas are texts that are specific to various sects, some more or less considered sacred. This is just the tip of the iceberg, but these are the important ones, and the ones that typically Hindus recognize as sacred scripture right across the board. There are also common theological concepts. Of course, we've already talked about Purushartha, the objectives of life. There are 4 Purushartha that all Hindus will acknowledge: Dharma, the right way of living; Artha, the pursuit of profitable pursuit of a livelihood or wealth. There's Kama, which is the central pleasures of life, and the all-important one, Moksha, which is liberation from the concept of samsara. Samsara is reincarnation. In Western term would be reincarnation. It's the birth, rebirth cycle, and moksha is the goal of existence, is to find moksha, which is to liberate oneself from samsara. Now we think, in the West, we think reincarnation is a cool thing. Oh, what were you in a past life? And wonder what I'll be in a future life. We like the idea of going on and on and on and on. Typically speaking in Hinduism, you want to come back as something better in the next life, but eventually you don't want to come back at all. You want to be liberated from this, because samsara is in some ways a trap. It's like, we have to generate karma in this life, good karma in this life, in order to come back as something better in the next, so that we can eventually be liberated from this awful cycle of samsara. Now, karma, samsara, and moksha are terms, are concepts that Hinduism shares with Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism. That needs to be said. So we need to figure out, well, if they share these concepts, why aren't Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism part of Hinduism? Well, there's historical reasons for that. But karma means, we understand karma in the West on a popular level, action, words, deeds, and sort of the moral law of cause and effect. Things that we do affect, have consequences later. Samsara is the idea of reincarnation, and moksha is the liberation of samsara. Talk about karma for a minute. Karma refers to the idea that the future is determined by acts of the free will in the present, under the circumstances set by actions and experiences in the past. Now that includes past lives and future lives. So if you were a scoundrel in a past life, then you were reborn as something worse in the next life. So the circumstances that are set up by your past life influence your future life. Now, to get out of that, you need to build up good karma, so that in the next life you'll come back as something or someone better. In some religions or some religious expressions, you could even come back as an animal or even a plant if you're really, really bad. And others, you always come back as a human. There are major denominations. I use that term. It's a Western term, but it's probably the best term that we have. Major cults, if you will. Cult has negative connotations. It shouldn't have. It simply means worship. But nonetheless, we'll call them major denominations within Hinduism. There's Vaishnavism, which is the worship of Vishnu, particularly the 10 incarnations of the god Vishnu, which include the most popular ones being Krishna and Rama. So under Vaishnavism, that's an umbrella term itself. You might have those who are worshipers of Krishna or Rama. You have Shaivism, which is the worship of Shiva, the god Shiva. You have Shaktism, which is the worship of Shakti. I put this in quotes, mother goddess. Some would take exception to calling Shakti a mother goddess. That said, it is the worship. Shakti is, if you will, the supreme god in the feminine. And Hinduism is the only religion that I know of that will refer or has sects that will worship the feminine aspect of the divine as being supreme. And Smartism, which is the worship of all the deities and seeing those as manifestations of a concept called Nirguna Brahman. The Nirguna Brahman is the Brahman without attribute. So those are the major, and by major denominations, I don't mean that every Hindu is part of one of these denominations, not in the least. These are just the major cults. These are the most, popular is not the right word, but these are the ones that get the most attention and have the most adherents. You might have heard at some point in reading or just in general that Hinduism has a concept of the Trinity. It's called the Trimurti, which means the three images of the supreme God. And that is correct, but I don't want to say that it's identical to the Christian Trinity, because it is not. But that said, it does have a fascinating, there is a fascinating analogy to be made between the Christian concept of God as three and the Hindu concept of the three images of God. They tend to be identified with the three gods, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. Now, let me just say that Brahma should not be misinterpreted or misidentified as Brahman. Brahman is something different. Brahma is a god. Brahman, as we talked about it, is the concept of the one unit underlying reality of the universe, of all there is. So this is how it's typically set up, but different sects have different ways of thinking in terms of the Trimurti. But this is the most common. This is the triple deity of supreme divinity. Brahma is creator, Vishnu is preserver, and Shiva is destroyer. And you might think, destroyer? Well, yes, in the transformative sense of the term, things die. In order to have new life, you must shed the old. So it's not nearly as as shocking as it might first appear. Hinduism also has some atheistic and agnostic strands in it, but we have to qualify those. There are certainly those who are culturally Hindu, which would be atheist in the modern sense of the term. But when you look at it historically, it's not, when we speak of atheistic or agnostic trends in Hinduism, we're not really talking in the same language as or the same concept that we would use in the West. These are strands or trends within certain of the philosophical schools, Samkhya, Yoga, and Mimamsa, philosophical schools of Hinduism. These are among the 6 Astika Darsana, that is the orthodox schools of Hinduism. Not to say that these are atheistic philosophies, they're not. There are those who would say that they tend or trend in that direction. So while not rejecting the Vedas or the Brahman, they typically reject the existence of a personal God or a creator God or a God with attributes. That's the idea. They still acknowledge the Brahman. They just don't see God in personal terms or as a personal entity. So that gives that was, if you will, part 1. We dealt with whether Hinduism was a religion. Part 2, I want to look at the Vedas, which I always try to find when I'm doing a major study on anything. I want to find I want to be able to determine what is foundational, what is it that holds everything together, and the earliest strata of textual tradition, the Vedas, I think would qualify in that respect. The Vedic period runs from about 1500 to 500 before the Common Era. And when we look at this Vedic period, early Vedic period, it is noted that this was a time of when the Indo-Aryan peoples began to migrate into the Indus Valley and to set up a civilization there. This is called the first urbanization of the Indian subcontinent. That said, I have to tell you that this itself is controversial, partly because of the word Aryan, and we know that Hitler and the Nazis had co-opted the term Aryan. It was a neutral term before the rise of Nazism, and all of a sudden became a very politically charged term. It need not be a politically charged term. The Indo-Aryans are, it's speculated, were a nomadic group that migrated from Central Asia right around the Black Sea area, just north of the Black Sea. They're noted to be the first charioteers. They built wagons, they had the wheel, and they migrated into modern day Iran, which is what we call Persia in the ancient world, and into the Indus Valley. It's In fact, we talk about Iran. Iran literally means Aryan. So the Iranians consider themselves to be Aryan. In fact, that is the name. We call, or in ancient times, Iran was called Persia by the Greeks because of the region of Iran called Parsis, a principality called Parsis, so it was called Persia. But the people of Persia never called themselves Persians; they called themselves Aryan or Iranian. We know that some type of migration must have happened because Sanskrit, the liturgical language of this people, is an Indo-European language. And way back in the 19th century, linguists were beginning to study languages and noted that Hindi and other Aryan, Urdu and other Aryan languages were related or had commonality with Greek and Latin and English and German. And they figured out that, hey, all of these languages come from some type of Proto-Indo-European language that scholars have since been able to reconstruct, very speculative. We don't know if they ever spoke this Proto-European language, but it was something that scholars like to do. They like to figure out the origin of things. So that is the basis for believing, plus some archaeological evidence, that this Central Asian peoples had migrated this far south onto the subcontinent. The Indo-Aryans had a pantheon of deities. They had heavenly deities like the sky and the dawn, the sun and the moon. They had nature deities, Mother Earth, the weather, fire, wind, water. They had societal deities for fate and welfare, and even for smithy, for blacksmiths. And of course, like many ancient peoples, they also deified their rulers, so that a ruler of the past would be considered a god. During the late Vedic period, the Aryan people started to push southward. The Kuru kingdom was really a network of different city-states, first empire, if you will. And this is when the Vedas are beginning to be written down. We'll get to that in a moment. But as they moved south, they came in contact with another very important culture, the Dravidians. Again, controversy here. People have tried to determine where the Dravidians came from. And there's a lot of controversy over that and whether there was a Dravidian people or not. There certainly is a language group that is related, and it's indigenous to the southern part of the Indian subcontinent. And it is not Indo-European. It is not related to Sanskrit at all. Tamil would be probably the best known of those languages, the Dravidian languages. But the Dravidian culture, for want of a better term, if you will, are the indigenous people of the subcontinent. The Aryans are the ones who've migrated into the Indian subcontinent. And when they come in contact with each other, what we have is basically an amalgamation of the Vedic tradition from the Indo-Aryans and the indigenous religions of the southern part of the subcontinent. And the influence of South India on Hinduism cannot be underestimated, should not be diminished in any way at all. Hinduism today is as colorful as it is and as varied as it is, not because of the Indo-Aryans, but because of the indigenous religions of India itself. It's the birthplace, South India is the birthplace of many of their saints and their important reformers. Most of their popular deities like Rama, Krishna, Ganesha, Hanuman. They all come from the south. The major denominations originated in the south, like Shaivism, and Vaishnavism, and Shaktism. They're all southern. They all originate from that very rich indigenous type religion. So if we look at Hinduism today, it's the amalgamation of the ancient Vedic tradition with these indigenous non-Vedic religions. I don't think that's too far from the truth. It's not too simplistic to see that. I think it's actually it's just common sense to look at it that way. Where the Indo-Aryans, their rituals were very simple. In ancient Vedic culture, basically their main ritual was a fire offering where they sat around an altar and they would throw food or drink upon the altar to the gods. In the south, you have the development of murti, that is the worship of the gods through images, and you have the development of temples and the iconography. That's all southern, and that's what we see as Westerners. We look at that and we see all this color, we see all these gods with all these arms. That did not come from the Aryans. That came from the Dravidian culture. So Hinduism is really an amalgamation of this ancient Vedic tradition, which is mostly textual, and the indigenous worship that was present throughout the rest of the subcontinent. In the late Vedic period, from about 1100 to 500 BC, this is the period that scholars will call the Hindu synthesis. And this is when these hymns, these Vedic hymns that had not been written down up to this point, are being collected and written down in Sanskrit. They're called the Vedas. This is the development of rites that are based upon the Vedas. And here we see in this period the emergence of a priestly caste responsible to perform these rituals. Now, I didn't prepare a slide on the caste system. I thought I'd save that for part 2. But nonetheless, the Vedas do hint that there's some type of division in the society, the Indic Aryan society, between 4 varna, or 4, we can call them castes, but that's a little bit anachronistic. So you have the Brahmin varna. That would be the priesthood, and then you have the warriors and the rulers, and then you have the craftsmen and the merchants, and then finally you have the laborers. So you have these 4 varna, and then you have outsiders, people who aren't part of society. Perhaps foreigners, and that would in time become the basis for untouchables. But the Vedas don't set up the caste system, and there's no sense in the Vedas, even though you have these varna, there's no sense in the Vedic tradition that these are hereditary, that you can't go from one. If you're a good warrior, but you happen to be raised as a craftsman, that you couldn't become a good warrior. There isn't this sense of caste yet. That comes a little bit later on than Vedic tradition, and that may have been part, again, of the Dravidian culture, where caste becomes hereditary. We have to determine there's 2 types of scripture. There's the Shruti, which is that which is heard, and the Smriti, that which is remembered. The Shruti, the Vedas would come under the category of Shruti, and by that they mean that which is divinely revealed. The Vedas are now written down, but originally they were not. So they were literally that which was heard, where the Smriti are commentaries that come later, that which is remembered. So one has, if you will, divine authorship, and the other set of scriptures is attributed to a human author. The Vedas are Shruti, not written, revealed by the gods, transmitted orally for generations and generations by sages that memorized the Shruti down to this very day. It may be written down, but the pronunciations, the melodies, the inflection, all of this is orally transmitted. Things that cannot be conveyed through a text are still transmitted orally down through the ages. The language is Sanskrit. Later sacred text, even some very early sacred text in Hinduism will also be written in other languages like Tamil, but the Vedas are Sanskrit. They constitute the foundational and most important sacred text throughout Hinduism. Full stop. This is why there is, if you will, a defined Hinduism, the Vedas. In fact, a recognition of their authority is what defines a Hindu or defines orthodoxy within Hinduism. You have two categories, roughly translated in Western terms, orthodox and heterodox, the Astika and the Nastika. I remember that because the Nastika are nasty. No, that's just that's how I remember it. Astika are the six darsana or darshana schools of Hinduism: the Samkhya, the Yoga, the Nyaya, I told you I was going to butcher these pronunciations: the Vaisika, the Mimamsa, and the Vedanta. We will look at the Vedanta later on in this presentation. We won't look at the others. But the Vedanta is probably the most important of the six orthodox or Astika darsana. The Nastika, the heterodox, are schools that do not accept the authority of the Vedas. Now, I want you to look at these. I'm not going to pronounce them all, but look at numbers 3 and 4. So there's an acknowledgement, even within Hinduism, that there's a relationship between Buddhism and Jainism. That there's a commonality there. There's something that relates to these religions, but since they don't recognize the authority of the Vedas, they're considered, Nastika. They're considered heterodox, outside of the mainstream. The Vedas, in brief, are guidebooks for how to perform the Vedic rites. They're hymns, if you will, and mantras to the gods while performing ritual sacrifice. And the main rite, as I said earlier, in this Indo-Aryan culture, was performed by the Brahmins. It was a fire offering, and it was a ritual that implied that if we give to the gods, then we receive blessings in returns. It's a ritual exchange between human and divine worlds. It also included what some would believe was some type of intoxicating or a psychedelic type drink called soma. There's a soma today. Not sure if that has any relationship to the soma of the era before Christ, but nonetheless, there's mention of soma. The Vedas provide a loose idea of what the theology of the Vedic age looked like. There are 4 Vedas. There's the Rig Veda, which is the earliest. And these are Sanskrit hymns that are orally transmitted from master to student, including how to pronounce words and the melodies to use, that one would use, and even how to inflect words with different tones, because different tones give words different meanings. There's the Samaveda. These are melodies and chants for worship. There's the Yajurveda, which were mainly prose mantras for worship. And finally, there's the Arthaveda, which are 730 hymns focusing on procedures for everyday life. You can see that these are in order of composition when they were written down, starting around 1500 all the way down to around 900 before the Common Era. Just to complicate matters more, Each of the Vedas is further divided into 4 parts. So all of these 4 Vedas have 4 parts. The Samhitas, which are the main part of each of the Vedas, these are the hymns and mantras to the gods. The Brahmanas, which are the commentaries that explain and contextualize the deeper meaning of the Samhita. There's the Aranyakas, these are commentaries on the deeper meanings of the ritual sacrifice. And there's the all-important Upanishads, which are philosophical texts that discuss life, death, existence, etc. So each of the 4 Vedas is divided into 4 parts. And already you can start to see a bit of the problem that we have with Hinduism. Everything is a commentary on a commentary on a commentary. The Upanishads, as I mentioned, the latest of the sections of the Vedas, also turn out to be of supreme importance to the development of Hinduism. The Upanishads are often called the Vedanta, which means the end of the Vedas, and that's literally what they are. They are the end of the Vedas. They're highly speculative. They are topical in nature. They're not hymns and mantras. They are basically philosophical writings. They introduce concepts and ideas not present in the other parts of the Vedas. All the earlier parts of the Vedas were concerned about ritual and the meaning of ritual. The Upanishads are concerned to ask the deeper questions and to look at the Vedas and reinterpret the Vedas in philosophical ways. The importance of the Upanishads is grounded in how they influenced the later development of Hinduism. In fact, their origin may lie in part outside of the Vedic tradition. Again, this is something of debate and controversy, but it seems clear that something was happening during the time when the Upanishads were being written that explain the further development of Hinduism. And that's something that was going on was the Shramana movement that occurred right around the middle of the first millennium before the Common Era. This is a time called the second urbanization. You can see that things have shifted from the Indus River Valley over to the Ganges. Why? Probably climate change. The archaeological evidence seems to indicate that things were getting dry over in the west and they moved to the east. It took place around 600 to 200 before the Common Era. What was the Shramana movement? It happened in the northeast part of India, the Ganges River urbanization. The debate is whether it grew up out of the Vedic tradition or was an independent movement, or if it was a combination of what was happening when the cultures were colliding. Shramanas are ascetics. The Shramanas, they sought enlightenment or liberation through asceticism. They weren't trying to attract crowds. They were trying to get away from the world. They were trying to live lives of extreme asceticism, starving themselves, not possessing anything. Yeah. Many of the Shramanas did not wear clothing. In fact, the Jain movement is noted for that their ascetics, their monks, still in one part of Jainism do not wear clothes. Now, this is in sharp contrast with the earlier Vedic tradition, because these Shramanas were looking within to find enlightenment rather than to the external rituals. In fact, they were very critical of external rituals. We find that in the Old Testament as well. In Judaism, some of the prophets are very critical of the temple and of outward ritual. They see religion as more of a matter of the heart. So there is an analogy there for us coming out of from a different background. There are some ideas that originated during this time, and no doubt from the Shramana movement, that are not part of the earlier Vedic tradition. The idea of karma. the idea of samsara, the idea of moksha. These are not ideas that were taught in the earliest part of the Vedas. They will be taken up in the Upanishads. But the question is, the Upanishads, which are commentaries on the Vedas, or the earlier part of the Vedas, the Upanishads are part of the Vedas. Where are they getting these ideas from? They're getting these ideas from the Shramanas. As I said, these ideas are not found in the early parts of the Veda. Now, this is also the time, the Shramana period is also the time when we start to see the origination of other religious ideas that will eventually become different religions. So, Jainism is a Shramanic tradition originating around 700 to 600 BCE, although the Jains will dispute that. They'll say their tradition goes back much farther than that. Buddhism, around 500 to 300 BCE. These are both distinct religions today. And then there were some rival movements to Jainism and Buddhism, which are now extinct. One of those, Ajivika, survived all the way up into the 14th century of the Common Era. So these are all movements that are characterized by their non-acceptance of the Vedas. So the Shramanas, some of them accepted the Vedas and some of them did not. So it seems to be a period of time in which the old Vedic tradition is being challenged from within and from without. And that challenge is what develops into what we call Hinduism today. The critical interaction between the Shramana movement and the Vedic tradition fundamentally transformed the Vedic tradition into something that would eventually develop into what we can recognize today as Hinduism. And the Upanishads are the key to that theory. The Upanishads represent a synthesis of the Vedic tradition with ideas and concepts that probably, no doubt, originate from the Shramana movement. Why do I say that? Because, of course, these non-Vedic religions like Jainism and Buddhism share these concepts. So they mustn't have come from the Vedas. The Upanishads reinterpret the ideas and concepts from the earlier sections of the Vedas, giving them new philosophical meanings. The Upanishads are preoccupied with this one concept that we introduced earlier called the Brahman. In the early Vedic tradition, there is mention of the Brahman, but the Brahman is simply the power of ritual sacrifice, the magic, if you will, behind ritual sacrifice. The Upanishads reinterpret that earlier concept of Brahman as defining it as the essence of existence itself. So everything comes from the Brahman and everything returns to it. In some interpretations, everything is the Brahman. A related term, and a term which will be debated amongst the scholars of the Upanishads, is the Atman. The Atman is defined as the essential self. In some ways, the Atman is identical to the Brahman. We'll talk about that in due course. In fact, we'll talk about that now. We will talk about that in terms of the Vedanta. The Vedanta, as I defined it earlier, means the end of the Vedas, and it refers to the Upanishads. But the Vedanta is also a school, a philosophical school within Hinduism. And that's where we want to turn to next in part 3. The Vedanta, one of the 6 darshana of the Hindu philosophy, arguably the most important of the philosophies. They take the Upanishads as their main inspiration. That's why they're Vedanta, the end of the Vedas. But they also revere texts like the Bhagavad Gita and the Brahma Sutras. They are preoccupied, these schools, with the question of absolute reality, Brahman and the self, and how the Brahman and the self relate to each other. The problem of the one and the many. Now, even though Vedanta is considered one of the 6 darshana, itself it is divided into different schools or sub-schools of thought. Not all that claim to be Vedanta agree with each other. Major themes, Brahman, as we talked about, also called Ishvara, which is the name of a god, is the material and instrumental cause of the universe. In some of the Vedanta schools, it is not the material and instrumental cause of the universe, but the efficient cause of the universe, which means that they don't believe that there was a cause, that is, that there was a beginning, but there is an underlying reality. The Atman, the Atman Jiva, in some schools, is called the self. It's the agent of its own activity, karma, its own actions, the recipient of its consequences. Now that will need to be unpacked a little bit more. Of course, samsara and moksha are very much part of that. Vedanta rejects Buddhism. There's a lot of discussion about Buddhism and Jainism within the Vedanta, and they also reject the conclusions of other Hindu schools where there's no agreement. But the all-consuming question of the Vedanta is the problem of the one and the many. No surprise there. The different branches, the Upanishads, the reason why there are different branches of Vedanta is because the Upanishads give different and seemingly contradictory answers to the questions which consumed the school of Vedanta. And this is only exacerbated, this problem is exacerbated by the fact that they just keep adding commentaries to commentaries to commentaries. So, you know, got the first layer, you got the Vedas, and then the second layer, you got the Upanishads, which are part of the Vedic tradition. They are part of the Vedas, but they're commentaries on the earlier parts. And that's where it begins. That's where the problem begins. You got these commentaries on the Vedas. But that, to make matters worse, then you got scholars who are giving commentaries on the Upanishads. What do they mean? And they're the Brahma Sutras, commentaries on the Brahma. And then, of course, you have the fourth layer, the Bhashya, which are commentaries on the Brahma Sutra and the Bhagavad Gita. And if you want to take this even further, even in modern days, if you pick up a commentary on the Brahma Sutras, you will find that there's a commentary on the Brahma Sutras, and so forth and so on. You've got all of these competing ideas, and someone comes along and says, well, this is what it really means. And then others who say, no, it doesn't. It means this. So this is part of the problem of the Vedanta school and why they can't seem to agree, the different branches, because there's commentaries over commentaries over commentaries over commentaries. But just to make it very simple, again, Brahman is the absolute one incomprehensible principle of existence. They all agree on that. The Brahman constitutes the oneness behind the veil of the illusion of multiplicity. So the answer to the question or the problem of the one and the many is simply to revert or reduce everything to the Brahman and to say everything else is an illusion of some sort. And that's the question, because you can't deny the phenomena that you see. It's like you can't say everything is one, everything is an illusion. You got to deal with the illusion. Why is there an illusion? And here we introduce the concept of the Atman. Now, a lot of Westerners think the Atman means the soul, or is analogous to the soul in Christianity or in Judaism. It really isn't. The Atman is the transcendent universal self. There isn't, I don't have an individual Atman, and you don't have an individual Atman. We all share in this one Atman. If you will, universal consciousness. On the scientific level, there are those who are trying to figure out, okay, we have materialism, but why are we conscious? And they're developed out of that question in the scientific realm. Well, perhaps consciousness is something that needs to be added to materialism in order to make sense of it all. And that's called panpsychism. To put it in brief, even scientists are trying to figure out, why we have a sense of self. In Hinduism, the Vedanta schools pretty much have explained this as that we all share in this universal consciousness or universal self. But it's not to be confused with Jiva. Jiva is the individual soul or living being. So we are all Jiva, which have a share in the universal consciousness of the that exists, the Atman. The Atman is the consciousness that pervades all things and that every Jiva shares in. The Atman is the sense of self that lies at the core of our being. It's not limited to our identity. Okay, so that defines the Atman. But now we have the problem of how the Atman and the Brahman relate to each other. So the differences between the branches or the Vedantin schools lies in how each of them understands the relationship between Brahman and Atman. The various schools, some will be they'll be defined as non-dualist or monistic, which means oneness. Now they don't have a term for, they have a term for oneness, but they don't call themselves, they wouldn't call it, Westerners would call them monistic. They'd rather use the negation not to, so non-dualist. And in some schools it's more absolute, and some it's more qualified. You also have dualist traditions of Vedanta. You have those which are theistic, believing that the Brahman is personal, or the gods are personal, and those who are non-theistic, believing that the Brahman is impersonal. So quite a lot of latitude, which leads to the question, well, what about the Brahman and the gods? And as far as the Vedanta schools are concerned, the gods of the Hindu pantheon are seen as manifestations or different aspects of the one Brahman. Sometimes a particular god is identified with the Brahman outright, like Vishnu or Shiva. So Vishnu in Vaishnavism is seen as the supreme manifestation of the Brahman and worshipped in that way. One of the very earliest of the Vedanta schools, as they began to define themselves in distinction with from each other, is called Beta Abheda. And this is the school that kind of set the parameters for the debate that would follow. Beta Abheda literally means difference and non-difference. The Brahman and the Atman are both the same and not the same. That's the explanation of the school. Now, did they explain it? No, that's the problem. They refuse to explain the paradox of the Brahman and the Atman being the same and not the same at the same time. It's a mystery, which later schools then developed in one direction or the other. So the three main branches, the triad, if you will, Vedanta today would be the non-dualist traditions and the dualist tradition. The first one is called Advaita Vedanta. Advaita literally means not two. It is an absolute non-dualism. So the Atman and the Brahman are the same. The second one is Vishishta Advaita. I don't know if I got that pronunciation right or not. Vishishta Advaita. It's qualified non-dualism. It's kind of like the, it's the middle ground. And the third one is Dvaita, which means two. So you got twoism in Dvaita, you got oneism or not twoism in Advaita, and you have a qualified twoism in Vishta Advaita. So those are the, if you will, the triad of Vedanta. There are other schools, but these are the main three that tend to explain the differences within the Vedanta school. Advaita, around 750 in the Common Era, a teacher named Adi Shankara he's not really the founder, but he's the popularizer and the main proponent of it. As I said, Advaita means not two, non-dual. Shankara taught that the Brahman is all, therefore all is one. In the West, we would call that absolute monism. There is nothing else but the Brahman. And Advaita taught the concept of Nirguna Brahman, that Brahman is without attributes, which means that everything that we can categorize is an illusion. The Brahman has no attributes, which would mean that the Atman, the universal consciousness that we all share in, the self, is identical to the Brahman. You can't distinguish the two. And when you distinguish the two, of course, you've fallen into the error of seeing of illusion. You're deceiving yourself. All multiplicity then is an illusion called Maya. Now, moksha, which is liberation in Advaita, if you will, analogous to salvation in Western religious traditions, all multiplicity is considered an illusion, Maya, and we are deceived into believing that there are different entities. So if you point to something and say that exists, well, you're deceiving yourself. It doesn't really exist. Nothing really exists except the Brahman, and the Brahman cannot be categorized. There's no gender. There's no attribute in the Brahman. Moksha then comes through jnana yoga, which literally means the knowledge of one's true reality. Of the major Hindu denominations, the Shakta and the Smarta traditions identify most strongly with Advaita. Although pure philosophic Advaita knows no cult. In other words, it's influenced these denominations, and there are Advaita trends within those traditions, but pure, unadulterated Advaita knows no cult at all. The influence on the West has been great since the 19th century. In fact, for a long time, I pretty much thought that Advaita was Hinduism, at essential Hinduism. But even though it has had this tremendous influence on the West, it's not as influential on the subcontinent as you would think that it would be. It's not the dominant form of Vedanta. Advaita downplays the importance of ritual and the religious aspects of Hinduism. And because of that, it's more palatable to the West, to a Western audience. And it's created this illusion that Hinduism is more of a philosophy than it is a religion. There's something shocking about looking at Hindu temples and the colors and the strange gods, some of them with elephant heads. Ganesh has an elephant head, some of them with many arms. It's very disturbing to Western eyes. So when Advaita was introduced to the West, they said, oh, okay, well, this is true Hinduism. All of the other stuff, that's, just kind of popular Hinduism. And we can deal with that by categorizing it as, folk religion. Where Advaita, that's true Hinduism. But that's not a good characterization at all. Vedanta does not equal Advaita any more than Hinduism equals Vedanta. Vedanta is just one of the 6 Astika schools. The second of the Vedanta schools is the Vishishta Dvaita, which is the qualified dualism. And here we'll call for better or for worse the founder Ramanuja, who has died in the early 12th century of the Common Era. Certainly as the popularizer and the major figure of Vishishta Dvaita. He taught a qualified non-dualism, what in Western terms we would call not a pantheism, but a panentheism. That God transcends the universe, but the universe is somehow contained in God. Ramanuja, sorry, denied, and the Vishishta Dvaita denied the concept of Nirguna Brahman, the Brahman without attributes. That's rejected. And the reason for that is because of, there are ritual reasons behind that. The Vishishta Dvaita school wants to make room for worship, for cult, for the continuing worship of the gods. The Atman, then, the self, the transcendent self that we all share, is thus not completely identical to the Brahman. That said, it's not separate from the Brahman either. It's rather in the Brahman. The world then is not an illusion, but within and controlled by the Brahman. And the Brahman is God, if you will. This tradition tends towards theism, or at least panentheism. Moksha, then, for the Vishishta Dvaita school, is one that primarily has its primary concern is the maintenance of ritual worship, which is called bhakti. They want to maintain that. So liberation is reached through the grace of God. Often God is considered personal through the worship, the bhakti. Vishishta Dvaita is probably the most influential of the Vedanta schools. It's the main theological position of one of the forms of Vaishnavism, Sri Vaishnavism, the worship of Vishnu. Finally, and we're going to end pretty soon here, Dvaita Vedanta, which literally means two. So you got you got not two, you got qualified not two, and now you have two. This is a dualist school, and its founder, Madhvacharya, died in the early 14th century. Dvaita meaning two, it's a dualistic interpretation of the Upanishads. The Atman, the self, is fundamentally separated and different from the Brahman. Two different realities. There's the divine, and then there's what exists, what we see, the material realm. This looks more Western to us. This looks more comfortable to us in the West because of the creator-creature distinction in Christianity and Judaism and Islam. The emphasis here is placed on devotion, bhakti, to God, and there are major cults within Shaivism and Vaishnavism, the worship of Vishnu and Shiva, which are Dvaita, are influenced by Dvaita or dualism. So moksha in Dvaita Vedanta, Dvaita would hold that God, for example, if one was a worshiper of Vishnu, and the individual souls, they combine the terms jiva and atman, the jivatman, the individual soul and its share in atman. They exist as independent realities. Nevertheless, individual souls are completely dependent upon God. God is identified with Brahman. So this Dvaita tend towards monotheism, or at least a henotheism. The difference between monotheism and monotheism is the belief that there's one God. Henotheism is the worship of one God, while acknowledging that there may be other gods in some sense of the term. So those who come about this from the standpoint of Dvaita, they will look at a god like Vishnu and say that Vishnu is the manifestation of the Brahman God, and all of these other gods are either Vishnu, an incarnation of Vishnu, or another aspect of Vishnu, but Vishnu is the God. Or they'll look at these other gods as deceased persons who once existed on earth, like Krishna, and they were rewarded for their virtues by being reincarnated into the heavenly world. liberation then would be reached through bhakti, which is the worship and devotion. Now I'm going to summarize each of these because I think they're very important. Although there are 6 philosophies in Hinduism, 6 Astika philosophies, Vedanta is certainly the most important because it influences the various denominations and cults throughout, and it's very Vedic based. So you have the Advaita Vedanta, where everything is the Brahman. There is no distinction. Any distinctions that we make, any qualifications, any categories that we would create are illusions. At the end of the day, when all is said and done, we simply have the Brahman. And the Western analog to that would be the philosophy of pantheism, that all is God. Vishishtadvaita is the concept that there is a distinction to be made between the Brahman and the Atman. The universal consciousness that we all share is different from the Brahman, although it's contained within the Brahman. So it is, in some sense, a part of the Brahman, but there's a distinction to be made. And the Western analog there would be panentheism, that God is in all things. And finally, Dvaita Vedanta is for, the Western analog would be considered theistic, if you will. The Brahman is God, and the Atman is separate from that, distinct from the Brahman. And that would be something that looks more familiar to us coming from a Christian, Jewish, or Islamic background than the others. Although in Christian thought, I have to say that the Vishishta Dvaita, the idea of panentheism, has since the early 20th century become an increasingly important philosophy, especially the Northhead, Alfred White Northhead came up with the idea that God transcended creation, but creation was still, in some sense, part of God. That is an increasingly popular idea even within Christianity. So you do see that even though the Western Abrahamic religions are very different and originate very differently than the Eastern Dharmic religions, that there's still points of contact which help us to make sense of what they believe, and perhaps even help with interfaith dialogue going forward. There is in fact a Christian ashram movement that developed in the early 20th century, where particularly Roman Catholic monks, Benedictine monk by the name of Bede Griffiths, went and started an ashram, a monastery, if you will, in the Indian tradition in India, in order to try to have a dialogue with Hindus on matters of reality and ontology. That became a little bit controversial. Bede Griffiths began to try to develop a theology, a Christology, a theology of Christ, using many of these terms that we've used today, and try to develop a different language, a language that would be indigenous, a Christian language that would be indigenous to the Indian subcontinent. Many people thought it was artificial and rejected it. Others thought it was a good start. Others fully embraced it. There were Hindus who thought, no, this is crazy, and others who accepted it. Because at the end of the day, Hinduism is a very tolerant religion. Hindus will walk into Christian churches and pray in Christian churches without any problem, without thinking that they were hurting the feelings of their gods or doing anything untoward in any way. uh, they see they're extremely tolerant that way. Now, there are cultural and societal, not to say that everything's peaceful between the religions. They are not necessarily. That is, Islam and Hindu have bickered and back and forth, and Christianity is oftentimes Christians have come in and have been considered, the religion of the of colonialization in the Indian subcontinent, and all of those critiques are very valid, and all of those hurts are still there. Those wounds are still there. Nonetheless, if a Hindu looked just at Christianity, the religion, and not to Christians, as Gandhi once said, "I love your Christ, I don't, not so much your Christians." They don't see something that can't be embraced as a way to truth, and you got to admire that. As far as Hinduism is concerned, it's one of the reasons why it continues to exist today, is that it has its history of amalgamating so many different local cults with this rich Vedic tradition, and turning it into this cultural phenomena that's so varied and vast, and with all these philosophic ideas. It can't but be generous in its estimation of other religions as other ways to finding God. Whatever we may think of that in the West, we can't help but admire their generosity in that respect. That concludes my my presentation today. I know I took you a little bit over time. I didn't think we'd have quite as many slides as I did. It turned out to be quite a number, but nonetheless, there you go. And thank you very much. I'm going to stop recording at this point.